Hey everyone, this is Reviews at Ryan. So today on the channel, I'm going to be continuing talking about Slasher Ripper, this time for episode 7. And we have one more episode left, guys. Can you believe it? We've done this for 7 weeks now. So this is going to be heavy spoilers. If you've listened to my past few recaps, you know that I've started to do spoilers. I just find it easier just to recap the episode and tell you guys my feelings rather than keeping it spoiler free because I have to dance around too much stuff. So it's just easier. So if you haven't watched the episode, come back. Or if you just don't care about spoilers, just join in and listen. So here we go. We'll talk about episode number 7. So the episode is only 44 minutes, and it starts out with George. He's daydreaming that he's running through the streets with Terrence. As you know, Terrence has passed away, and he actually has a sex dream about Terrence. And during this sex dream, Margaret appears, and Margaret says to him, "You did this to me." So then he wakes up from this nightmare, and we cut to a scene where we see Dr. Isabel's body laying on a lab tech table. And she has a charred body because on the last episode, if you remember, she was electrocuted by the widow. This time we see another note that has been left by the widow. And of course, the detective is really pissed off about the fact that Dr. Isabel was electrocuted and killed. He's getting really ticked in this part of the episode. And he says to the security guys, "Hey, where the heck were you?" And the guy goes, well, we had a security guy that, called off and we didn't really have anybody throughout the night. And so he gets really mad and he's like, the blood of the hands of this victim is on my hands and on your hands as well. And he gets really mad about it, and I don't blame him. He's just really frustrated with everything really going on. So then we cut to Garvey, and he gets free from jail. And he says to the guy that lets him free, "Hey, who spoke up? Who's letting me out?" And the guy says, well, basically the detective says that there's no way you could have killed Israel while you're in jail, so you're free. And he goes, "What? Israel's dead?" And he goes, "Yeah." So then we cut to Shamika, who is George the magician's assistant. And she says to him she's afraid of dying. She doesn't want to be in this mess with the widow. She's going to leave, and she is not going to be a part of his act anymore. So she bails on him. And by this point, George is really distraught. He's having all these nightmares like we saw in the beginning of the episode. And he's really starting to lose it in his mind. It's very obvious. And he says to her, "Look, Margaret, she may be dead, but she's the dead walking amongst us." He thinks that she's come back to basically get her revenge. He thinks that she's the widow, and he's just very much losing his mind. We cut to Verity, and she's very happy that Garvey is free from jail, and she says that she's really happy. She's freed from her sisters forever. And Garvey, he gives her all these kind of compliments. He's really overjoyed that she seems really happy. And Verity says to him, "Well, you have spent that dreadful night in jail. You must be desperate for a bath or a meal." And Gladys is there, and she'll cook the meal. And so he gets really excited by this, and he thinks, "Hey, I'm gonna try to get into her pants." And she says, "No, that's not happening. I'm going to have sex with someone that I'm familiar with and that I marry." And so he's very obviously very distraught by this. He really wants to get with her, but she denies him, obviously. So then we cut to the pastor with Miss Simcoe, and the detective visits Simcoe. And the pastor, he's lying in bed, and he says that, he's okay. The doctors are there, and they're taking care of him and stuff. And the detective, he's talking about suspects, and he says to Simcoe that the only suspects that are left in the photo is Basil, George, and Viviana. So then they start talking about each individual. They talk about George and say that, he's had alibis, but he could be somebody. And then they talk about Viviana, Basil, of course. And then they talk about Terrence being killed by Salome, he mentions that George didn't do that, obviously. It says to Simcoe, like, who else do you think it could have been if it's nobody in this photo? He says, is there anyone else at the party? And she says, well, it could have been Venetia. It could have been somebody like in the staff. It could be a photographer. We cut to Verity and Basil. They're walking down the street. And of course, Basil is making all these really nice comments to Verity, making her blush. And he says to her, oh, I wish that I can make you blush every day. And she seems to be very happy with him. And as they're approaching and walking down the street, they meet Venetia and Viviana. Venetia wants to talk to Basil about the payments with Verity. She's very adamant about it. And then Viviana and Verity, they start talking. And they start taking some jabs at each other. Viviana, she's obviously very jealous that Verity is with Basil because Viviana wanted to be with him and obviously be more rich. You know, she thinks he's a handsome guy. They start taking some jabs at each other. And Verity says, like, you're going to end up with a farmer and I'm going to be rich, basically. And she says back to her, look, you're not going to be his last. He's already been married 3 times. He's going to use you. When he's done using you, he's going to whore you out. And you're just going to be another victim of his and just going to be on the streets having sex for money, is basically what she says. And this actually starts a fight. And they start fighting each other. And she rips part of her clothing. And that's the end of that scene. So then we cut to George, and he's digging up a grave in the graveyard, and he's trying to find Margaret. And when he goes to dig up her body, he goes to peek for her body, and the body's gone. So he screams. So then we cut to Verity and Basil at the auditorium, and George ends up coming in, and he shows the secret casket that they have in there to his act. Basil shows Verity the key and how it works, and it's a sawing act where you try to saw someone in half and they have this key, so they go into the secret compartment, so when they actually cut, they're not actually cutting them. So they talk about that. And then we have George coming in, and he talks to Basil. He's very distraught. And he knows he has this last show and it's sold out, but he seems like he doesn't really want to do it. And he says to Basil, he goes, look, Margaret's body's gone. And Basil says, well, probably the widow probably dug it up to scare us all. So then he says to him, you know, it's a sold out show. You need to get your shit together. And he says, well, my assistant fled, Shamika. So he says to her, well, Venetia would take her place. Apparently she knows the acts. So apparently she's been to all his shows and different shows across the country, I guess. So Venetia is the one that's going to volunteer. Viviana gets very pissed that Venetia's in the show. When is she ever happy? She's always complaining about something. So George, he starts the show. And he says that he's going to make the widow banish and get rid of the widow in his act. And of course, Venetia is dressed up as the widow. She removes her hood so we see her. And then he starts sawing away. And Venetia, she fakes like she's screaming. He goes, you know, put some emotion into it. You know, don't act so fake with it. So he starts sawing away. And Venetia starts saying, you know, stop, it hurts. It really hurts. And then she starts screaming, and he's going deeper and deeper with the saw. And we see blood gushing out of the coffin. And she ends up dying on stage. And during this time when this act is going on, the detective sees the real widow in the theater, and the widow ends up fleeing through the woods. And so he chases after the widow in the streets and into the woods, and eventually they end up meeting at the graveyard, and he's ending up down on the ground. And he says something along the lines of, vengeance isn't justice. And then the widow ends up disappearing. So then we go back to the theater, and they're investigating what happened with Venetia. And they notice that the trap door is locked. So who had the key? And of course, Viviana is very upset that her sister is dead. She's just very distraught. And so they're looking for the key, and then they find out that Viviana hid the key in the dress. So then the detective is like, "You're under arrest." And of course she denies it. She's like, "I would never do that." And he's like, "You're under arrest for everything. You're the widow. You committed all these murders." And then we end up getting 12 years later where we see George. And we see that George ended up choking Margaret. And then we see a cut back to present day, and George is getting the same fate of getting choked. But this time the widow has taken ropes and wrapped it around his neck and is squeezing really tightly, and he ends up getting choked out to death. Before George does die, though, we do see him utter the words, "I deserve this." So that was very interesting that he finally accepted his faith. So then we go to the fact that Simcoe is with the pastor again, and the detective says, "Hey, we caught the widow. Finally, it's Viviana." And we start to see, and I would say a little bit before this part, towards the beginning of the episode, we start to see that Simcoe and the detective form a love connection, which I thought was kind of weird. I don't know. I don't know if I really agree with that direction. But they have this love connection. They start talking kind of, I wouldn't say sexual, but just like really nice to each other, very respectful of each other. And basically they say, like, the detective says, "I'll escort you to your house, and we can trust the doctors here. The pastor will be fine. You can leave the pastor here." And as they're walking, Simcoe says, "Well, I won't be seeing you anymore. It makes me sad." And, she's going to miss his probing of questions. And so he says to her, "Well, hey, I'll go in the house with you and make sure everything's okay." And she says, "That's fine. I told the servants to take the night off anyway." So then we cut to Viviana, or actually Verity, I should say. And we see that they are talking, her and Garvey, in this carriage. And Garvey says that she's very perceptive. Garvey knows that Verity rigged the box and she planted the key for Viviana. And Verity starts breaking down. She's like, "Oh my gosh, I need to confess." But Viviana's going to pay. And Garvey says, "Well, no, you don't need to be telling them that you did that because they hated you. They sold you to me." And he says, "You should be proud of yourself. You're a fighter, and only fighters survive in this world." That's what he tells her. So he tells her, keep your mouth shut, don't say a word, act like you didn't do a thing, basically. So then it cuts to Viviana going to jail. She's stripped of her clothing. She's thrown a bunch of cold water. And I'm not sure who this person is, but there's a person in there that starts cutting her hair, and she's screaming and pleading. And it's very obvious that she's not a well-liked person. So this person that's cutting her hair and treating her very badly in jail, abusing her, so to speak. And that's really for how she's treated a lot of other people. So I understand that treatment there. I understand that frustration from this woman. So then we end up cutting back to Simcoe and the detective. And they end up kissing. And they end up having sex. There is a storm going on outside. He wakes up in bed. And then we get this suspenseful kind of music. It shows like a quick scene of a graveyard. And then the episode ends up closing. And it shows him closing his eyes. And Simcoe and him are sleeping together. And that was the ending of the episode. So this episode, I felt it had quite a bit of filler in it. I'm not really sure if I really agree with the love connection that much between Simcoe and the detective, but that's the route they went. It was only 44 minutes, was much shorter than some of the episodes we've gotten previously. I feel like the Botticelli sisters, they just seem like, I don't know, their motivation and I guess just what's going on with them is, it's sort of strange, I guess I should say. I don't really have too much thoughts on this episode. I just feel like it's one of those filler episodes. Obviously, we get more of the whole backstory of Margaret, and we see that George, the magician, is obviously responsible for that death. And we just see more of Basil just doing what he does best, trying to get into Verity's pants. And we just see kind of Verity seeming to warm up to him, it seems like. Definitely different from the last episode when she was wanting to run away. So, interesting that she did a 180 here. But that's really all my thoughts on this episode. Not really anything else that really happened that really I could discuss. Obviously, there's just the one death, so nothing else really to talk about on that front. Wouldn't say it's a brutal episode or anything like that. Like I said, it's a lot of setup for this last episode. So I'm interested to see where the last episode goes and finally getting a wrap up and finally getting a reveal of who this widow is, hopefully. But thank you guys for listening to this recap. Let me know down in the comments, what did you think about this episode? Did you agree that this is a filler episode? I would say, like, as far as what went down in this episode, I guess you could say it's kind of weak. I feel like, again, the love story between the detective and Simcoe, it seems like a really late addition to have into the story at this point. And I don't buy their love connection at all for a second. So I get that they're kind of chillish people, but I don't agree with the love connection at all, really. But those are my thoughts. Thank you guys for listening, and I will see you guys on the final episode recap.